Michelle, it's relentless bad news. Tell us how long lasting do you think for this drop? And is there any chance it doesn't get that bad?
Sure. So, we're forecasting that, as you mentioned, a 50% decline in new home sales. Housing starts perhaps a bit more existing, probably a little bit less than that given the stickiness in the existing home market. But it's going to be quick in our view. So we're going to see a sharp decline in activity as a result of the shelter at home policies in the next few months. Probably by midsummer, we reach that low, and then we work towards getting to a recovery into the end of the year. But it's really hard to see how you don't have a sharp decline in housing activity as a result of the lockdowns and as a result of the job losses, the income shock, the negative wealth shock.
Right.
There are a lot of things that aren't working favorably right now for housing in the near term.
Yeah, maybe it's almost easier to talk about the near-term effect from simply the shutdowns and kind of the halt in activity. What do you think happens longer term? Because housing has been such an important barometer of both the bubble last time around, it kind of sat out the early years of the recovery or what we had. It was a much bigger part in terms of contributing to growth lately. What happens now?
Yeah, so you raised a few really good points there. First is just to compare it to the housing bust. This is a very different housing market. Heading into the last housing recession, housing was a very large share of the economy. There were excesses, both in terms of construction and in terms of leverage. That's not the case today. The housing market is currently pretty lean. So you're going to see a decline in demand because of the nature of this recession. But I do think that means the future looks more promising in that we will be in an environment where inventory will be very low, home building will be very low relative to fundamentals, relative to household formation rates. So I do think you get a recovery. It might be slow in the beginning, given the nature of the reopening, but the fundamentals do suggest a brighter future ahead for housing, especially relative to what we had in the last housing bust, where it took years to get to a recovery.
Yeah, I'm getting more worried about the mortgage market just because standards are getting tightened and, JP Morgan's not doing HELOCs. The banks don't want their balance sheets to grow any further and so forth. That's a separate issue. I'm just curious in terms of the demand piece. Do you see this pushing people out of, cities into the suburbs? And would anyone like to buy my neighbor's house?
Yeah. So there is a question about the structural changes, how people's preferences are adjusting. Urban centers are highly populated, they're dense, and not very good for pandemics, clearly. So a lot of people have already started to think about relocation, at least temporarily. And the question is if that leads to more permanent preference changes. We had a number of structural changes after the last housing bust, too, in the opposite way. After the last housing correction, people moved from the outskirts into the urban areas, into the cities, particularly as millennials were forming households. That seemed to be the preference back to renting to smaller properties, to urban areas. It's possible that now starts to switch on the back of this pandemic. So you do have to think about how preferences adjust because housing is so personal.
Right. No, I wonder about people who might say, well, I wonder if I could keep my job that pays big city money, but I could go live somewhere really cheap and that whole phenomenon. What do you think in terms of the lower price segment of the housing market that had been the strongest going into this? Is it the strongest coming out or does it suffer a harder hit?
Yeah. So, when you think about the stages of the last recovery, the first to recover after the housing bust was the high end market. And then more recently, in the last few years, it's been the lower end of the market. That's where home builders have been focusing. They've been gearing up towards this wave of first-time home buyers to come in that finally have had a sufficient income gain after the last recovery. And unfortunately, that's where you're probably going to see the biggest hit, at least initially, given the more budget-constrained nature of those households and the fact that they're probably not going to, have that income for a down payment or have the willingness to take on such, debt or burden at the moment to purchase a property. So I do worry initially about the lower end of the market getting hit first. But at the end of the day, if you have, such a big adjustment in demand, it's really hard to not see that on an aggregate basis.
Right. Absolutely. Nope. It's great stuff, Michelle. We appreciate, you guys digging into it and trying to come up with some of the longer term effects. Thanks for joining me.